Well, it's so great to be here chatting with you. Your work's been inspiring me for a long time, and it's so important the way we talk about ground. It's so important to think about the way we talk about ground and how different cultures talk about ground and have talked about ground and earth. And so this feels like an enormously important subject, and I'm grateful for all the effort you've made to bring this into greater discussion and into greater conversation. And I love so much your work on termites and termite mounds and the relationships between West African indigenous populations and termites, and the way that these relationships are conceived of by the local people and mythologized, and the way that termites are understood to be part of the divine creation, and a very important part of the divine creation. And this seems to reflect in part the importance of termites ecologically to people's lives in the way that use this great term to wake up the soil. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way that people and termites relate to each other in these parts of West Africa, and also a little bit about the way that termites have found their way into these cosmogonies.
Brilliant, brilliant. I suppose one way to enter into that is to get a sense of where I'm working in West Africa, but in the sort of transition zone between forests and savannas, where you get these landscapes with termite mounds quite prominent within the savannas, but out of which often trees are growing, a little bit like islands. And one of the strangest occasions for myself was hearing someone say that we are like termites. And I found that really perplexing. Wasn't quite sure as an anthropologist what on earth that meant. And it took years really to puzzle it out, in the sense that wherever termites sort of build their mounds, which are sometimes these vast macrotermes kind of mounds, you tend to get vegetation very different to the vegetation around. Some certain trees will grow where otherwise only grasses would grow. And so out of termite mounds, you get these extraordinarily diverse ecologies, and animals come and sit on the mounds and defecate, and seeds kind of grow. And so a termite mound becomes a little kind of mini ecosystem. And people say we're like termite mounds, almost for that reason, because wherever you settle a village, you bring wood and burn the wood, and you for the fires where you do the cooking, and you bring straw in for the thatch, and you bring your crops in, and from all the surrounding area you kind of bring everything to the village, and everything that you bring renders the village fertile. And that creates all sorts of new kinds of possibilities for trees. And around every settlement in the place, in the Kisii region of Republic of Guinea where I was working, every settlement has around it a sort of island of forest, just like termite mounds all have their particular vegetation. And so gradually we worked out that there's something going on with the ways people are understanding ecology, which is about accumulating fertility. And that accumulation occurs also in fields where people are farming fields, but there's the odd termite mound here and there, and people see that those termite mounds actually produce in the vicinity of them really lush, better crops. There's something that the termites are doing to render the place more fertile, a better crop. In fact, people really struggle to get hold of a termite mound when you demarcate a field from your neighbor, and you sort of sometimes put the mound, the line of demarcation across the mound in order to sort of divide it equally so that everyone, gets a little bit of it. So this appreciation of termites sort of comes from all sorts of different sort of signals, and gradually begin to understand that it's that the soil isn't just something that kind of is there naturally and that is gradually eroded away, which is a very British kind of way of understanding the soil. But the soil isn't like that. The soil is a sort of a matrix that is given life by things. It's given life by people working the land, incorporating material into it, and termites turning that material into in some way or another, the kinds of nutrients or the substrate that makes soil, and the ash that people produce through burning trees also gets into the soil. So soils are made by people, by people's relationship with the insect world of those soils. And it's that collaboration with soil and soil processes, collaboration with termites, that's really reflected a little bit in some of the mythology behind the termites, because it's the termite that enables the soil to become fertile, and thus we depend upon the termites. Termites thus are sort of there first. We're their juniors, they're our elders, and we should respect them. And so the mythology of the region is associated with this kind of respect for a creator god, and a creator god that first created one or two animals, of which termites is very often the first or second or third, that helps produce the conditions in which people can grow. And I was fascinated to read your book, in a way, to see that somehow the fungi were there before plants. And I had no knowledge of this kind of genealogy of plants, that somehow the plants coming out of the waters needed the helping hand of fungi in order to establish themselves on land, and to establish associations with algae first, and then enabling plants to evolve. So I was really taken by this. I wondered if what are the implications of that history for the way we should really understand the place of fungi in relation to plants?
Yeah, it fits very neatly with this idea of termites as key parts of the creation story. It's always funny how the sciences provide creation stories of their own, and evolution is this creation story that the modern biological sciences have provided us with. And certainly within this creation story, fungi are these key co-creators of the terrestrial biosphere. It was only with the help of fungi that plants could make their transition from fresh water onto land. And it's an astonishing story, really. So the ancestors of land plants were freshwater algae, and they lived their life most of all they were floating around in this kind of nutrient broth, so they could eat light and air in the process of photosynthesis, but they didn't have to look very hard for their nutrients, because they were floating around in their nutrients. So a different situation when they washed up onto land, they're suddenly faced with a whole set of new challenges. One of the big challenges is how to explore this sort of solid, damp matrix of these young soils. And they didn't have roots to do so. And so this is where these fungi came in, the ancestors of what we now call mycorrhizal fungi, on which 90% of plants depend to this day. And so these fungi, there's this set up a polarity with these early algae. The fungi dealt with the ground, with the foraging of nutrients from the ground and water. And the algal part dealt with the light and with the air, this atmospheric pole. And so we still have that. When plants depend on mycorrhizal fungi, it's the fungi are making possible their foraging in the soil, and still helping to help the plant resist drought and supply with mineral nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, like they've been doing since the beginning. So in this creation story that we tell about the origin of these soil, of course, these soils, this earth is created by the action of plants and fungi, follows this relationship into being. So absolutely, these fungi have played this this key role in creating the conditions for all of animal life on land, that is certainly ours, and maintains it to this day. And so when we think about plants and we think about the way that these organisms which sustain us in so many ways, whether it's food or medicines or materials like wood, paper, that all these plants that we think about, these are really the outgrowths of an association. They're the outgrowths of an ancient alliance. And when you eat a plant, the leaves and shoots of plants are still bristling with fungi, these fungi called endophytes, which live in their leaves and shoots. And so for me, this really changes the way I move about in the world. It changes the way that I behave to the salad on my plate. You know, there's an experiential shift that occurs for me, which is just one of the reasons why I'm so curious about these relationships, and I spent this time researching them, is because it really does change the way I experience the world. And so, of course, what's amazing is that we haven't actually known about these fungal relationships explicitly for very long. It's only in the 19th century that mycorrhizal associations were named and started to be studied in any kind of systematic way. And so, for much of human existence, we've been cultivating plants and thus cultivating fungi, but without knowing that we're doing so. And this has happened in other cases as well, like with yeasts, and there are other such examples. But I wonder, in relation to the termites, because the termites you're studying in Africa, they have these immensely sophisticated relationships with fungi. They're agriculturalists. They've been farming fungi in towering mounds for 20 million years or so, far longer than humans have been around, let alone cultivating other organisms. And so I wondered, and these feats are amazing. The Termitomyces mushrooms, which grow from these fungi in their mounds, these are a human delicacy, but humans have never worked out how to cultivate them and the termites have. And the termites are able to provide with the fungi with the damp conditions they need to grow in these very hot regions of the Sahara by the skillful use, skillful building of their mounds, these sophisticated architectural mounds that have air conditioning systems and make the conditions for this fungi to grow. So I'm wondering, how much do people in whose lives and culture that you study, how much do they think about the fungi that relate to the termites? Do they have a conception of the fungal termite relationship, or is this something which rather goes unsaid?
Well, that's an interesting question in a way. I mean, one of the easiest answers is yes, because certain fungi, edible fungi, come out of termite mounds, just as termites sometimes come out of termite mounds. So once a year, when the flying part of the termite society, the alleles, come out. But so fungi, each kind of termite mound is associated with a certain kind of, I'm going to call them mushrooms because I'm not an expert, you see. But some of them are edible and used as a sort of as a delicacy, and others are used for medication. So there are certain kinds of termite mound that are used to treat certain kinds of ailments. And this is what I've been sort of recently exploring, is the place of termite mounds in general and the soils that they are producing, not just in farming, but also in the spectrum of materials available to treat ailments. And so, like you say, termites, they have this amazing architectural results, which is to build, which are these huge mounds, but they're over the top of really deep channels down into the earth, into which they're also building lateral kind of air flow that work almost like a chimney, that draw water up from the aquifers to render really dry places quite moist and humid. And that through that, we scientists were able to see that they create the humidity needed for fungi to grow and for them to do their fungal farming. But at the very same time, they're producing kinds of soils that are enriched in certain ways because the water is coming up from below, evaporating and bringing the salts that are present in the deep aquifer up to the surface. And so the soils of termite mounds, especially in the interior, are really rich in minerals that actually on the surface are very poor in these really ancient soils. So people have learned to treat termite mounds medicinally, not just for the association with the certain fungi that quite possibly or probably have medicinal qualities, but also because the earth itself is enriched in certain minerals. It's a bit, and so there is this sort of practice of eating into the interior of a termite mound, and many people who are sensing a sort of crave for this soil. And plant chemists better than myself are able to show how these soils are actually very rich in minerals, are the sorts of minerals that we really do need in order to live in places where minerals are actually pretty difficult to get hold of. And so it's a bit like going down to the pharmacy and going to get your multivitamin pills and your mineral pills. You can go to the termite mound and get the same kind of hit that you get out of a pill, especially if you're sort of craving for it. You can feel good, but not just feel good, but become healthy in certain ways. And so pregnant women, especially in this region, have ways of preparing the soil of the interior of termite mounds to create the possibilities of pregnancy and to see through a pregnancy to a birth, reliant upon this kind of termite mound earth and we can say it's mineral supplement. Locally, it's not understood necessarily as minerals, but they have other ways of understanding this what it is in the mound that helps people. And quite recently, some of the science of termite mounds is showing that these earths don't just have mineral properties, but also through their fungi and perhaps also through symbiotic bacteria that the termites nurture in their earths, they have some antimicrobial or even antibiotic properties. And so it's quite feasible that these mounds that are both fungal and termitey are also bacterial in these kind of wonderfully kind of complex, I'm not quite sure, unities. You've probably got the right sort of word for it. But so the way people understand the mound isn't necessarily simply as a place where fungi grow, but it's a place where prosperity comes from, and health, and so on. And these fungi are kind of the signal, the sign of prosperity, especially when so many fungi come out. It shows a very healthy kind of mound, a very important mound, a very the sort of mound that would bring prosperity. And so it's that kind of relationship that I've been intrigued by, and intrigued in that sense also by your book, because this kind of sense of fungi being foundational to the plant world is curious, because you say that it's really only very recently that we're beginning to understand these mycorrhizal networks. And we've, as it were, predicated our understanding of the natural world on plants, which are quite easy relatively to understand. But suddenly we find that plants are dependent massively on these beings that were there first. So we've almost begun to create a vocabulary for understanding ecosystems based on a latecomer, rather than based on the early sort of mycorrhizal networks, which actually have very different sort of properties, almost networked properties that you show in this book. Very hard to tie any mycorrhiza down to a particular species or a particular individual. You even showing that nuclei of one mycorrhizal filament, are varied. Is it possible to speak of a particular species of mycorrhiza? Even that's up for grabs. So at the very heart of biology, at the very heart of our plant world, you're showing us that these words we use, individual plants, and are almost they're almost the wrong vocabulary for understanding the world in front of us. I wonder what, if I were to posit that, are we using, have we got the wrong vocabulary?
I wouldn't say wrong, but it's certainly inappropriate to understanding some other types of life. And of course, we need these words. They do useful work for us, especially in our own human lives, where our political, economic systems and philosophical systems depend on being able to identify neat individuals. I don't know how much good that's done us in the really big picture of things, but it's certainly convenient for these dominant paradigms that we've lived within for some time. And so when we're looking at the lives of these fungi, it's these categories that we use become questions. It's like, how can we understand these organisms using these categories which are woefully inadequate? Do we ditch the category, or do we just deepen and expand our understanding of, say, an individual or autonomy or independence? And I think really it's that, because we're interacting with plants, and so there's this field of interaction between humans and plants that's gone on for a long time, and likewise a field of interaction between humans and fungi that's gone on for a long time, and there's some way that our logics have to meet in the middle, and so if we think about, say, fungi in these foundational terrestrial ecosystems, they couldn't do it by themselves. They also needed plants there, plants to pump all this carbon down below the ground to power these underground networks. And so there's this whole dense interrelationship of practice and different types of being in living organs. So I wonder how these terms can sort of come to meet in the middle. And so independence for me, or individuality, I've started to think less about ditching that term, but more about selfhood, and whether we can learn to grow the boundaries of ourselves. Can we stretch our concept of selfhood so to include different organisms or different relationships at different moments, to realize that when we use this term self, it's an elastic term that we use for convenience anyway. So why not make it more convenient or more appropriate to this certain situation when we're talking about plants and fungi and humans? So I like the idea of stretching selfhood, stretching individuality, and deepening them, expanding them. And one of the ways that we this happens quite naturally is when we think about all the things that we depend on in order to survive. Jack Forbes writes this wonderful passage where it's like, you can cut off my arm and I'll survive. You can take out an eye and I'll survive. Likewise, an ear, a leg. But cut off the air supply and I'll die. Cut off the water supply and I'll die. And so there's many ways that these, of course, as have been known for a very long time by very many cultures around the world, that we depend not just on the living features of the world that surround us, but on these physical features of the world, what we might call physical features of the world around us. In fact, many people for a long time have thought of as living features of the world because they bring life. And so our bodies are these open systems in constant interchange with our surroundings. And so the porous individual, the expanded individual, the stretched self, I think fungi can help us to enlarge and enrich our understanding of the living world. and to maybe help us to adjust to these difficult times that we find ourselves in. And I love this idea so much, what you say with the termite mound meaning prosperity, this huge flushes of mushrooms sprouting out the top, and a place where medicines can be found, a place where fertility comes from, a place where pregnant women might go to eat mineral earths to allow them to conceive and give birth. This is deeply generative, deeply generative properties of these termite mounds. So, and of course, the soil in general is that. The soil is where all these things come from. The soil is where food comes from. The soil is where, and even if you don't eat these earths, when you eat medicinal plants, they need the soil to grow. So there's this sense in which all soil can be thought of as prosperity, as this generative medium from which life springs. So yeah, I find that so helpful to think about the termite mound as this little sort of microcosm of this upwelling of generativity coming from earth, mediated by bacteria, mediated by fungi, mediated by termites and plants, and all there working together. And it reminds me so much that the way we think about the soil often now is in terms of it, just as you said at the beginning, just sort of just a dead inert matrix. And certainly industrial agriculture has taken this view, perhaps not because it's thought about it, but because it hasn't thought about the life of the soil. And a lot of your work is pointing out that soils are made, soils are created by living organisms, termites, humans, fungi, bacteria, all together. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, more in general, how you see this relationship between these worldviews, between soil as this kind of dead space and soil as as something that co-emerges with the activity of living organisms who actually make it.
Well, you've asked a really pertinent question. That for many decades, people have been traveling from the scientific institutions of universities such as my own and from all over the world to study tropical soils and their decay. And one of the ways in which to understand how much soils have seemingly been eroded is to go to some of the places where the soils are at their best and imagine them to be their most natural. And they've gone to the soils underneath forests because they're construing forests to be kind of natural vegetation. And they've been finding really thick, dark soils in these places. And then they sort of go outside these forests into the savannas, the grasslands, and they find very thin soils. And their assumption is that the soils under forests were the original soils, and people have deforested the land, and then the soils elsewhere have kind of decayed. And the world thus is represented as one where there are just a few, places where the original soils are, and you can go and study them and find out just how super fertile they once were, and then you can start blaming African farmers for having destroyed these great soils and left, these really thin savanna soils that are baked in the everyday sun and washed away. Coloniality has been kind of drawn into this way of understanding soils, because, frankly, the very best critique of that is to see these amazing soils under these fantastic forests as the very same soils that have been created by people out of the very poor soils that are still there next to them. And so farmers in this region, they say that the very best soils are the soils of old settlement sites, of ruined settlements. And in any village territory, there might be 10 or 12 kind of old places where people used to live, which have great soils, and people flock to those soils to do their farming. And they also have, really great mycorrhiza, and really great termite mounds. And so former settlement sites are the places where termite mounds really abound. And what's going on here is that people, through working the land and through concentrating fertility, almost switching the soils on. They're upgrading them. And the charcoal that comes from the ash of the fires that people are lighting every day to do the cooking. That gets seeping into the soil. And other materials gradually seeping into it and making layer upon layer of darker earth that then becomes super fertile soils. And so good soils are the things that are produced by people. And so the very same soils that ecologists from here are construing as natural and the baseline from which to understand degradation are in fact the very same soils, those that are historically produced by people, showing just how much people have created that soil. So what people have created is being used against them, if you can follow my reasoning. And in very disastrous ways, because we do need to understand how soils can be generated, can be produced in actually quite relatively quick time. It doesn't take millennia to produce these thick, rich, dark earth soils. It takes a decade or two. And it is quite possible to render soils that are poor very fertile. Farmers do it in this region. So so it has a lot of stories for us, a lot of in a sense more optimism the moment you start tuning into these regenerative processes that farmers have been using in order to upgrade their lands, and not just farmers today, but people's ancestors have also been upgrading lands through the very act of settlement. And so people see fertility as emergent from past in human habitation, not from some natural background that is then kind of lost. So so we're getting a sense that soils are really at the heart of life, but people are at the heart of soils, and people are sort of cohabiting with these other processes which are fundamentally important to their lives. So the fungi, the termite mounds, and indeed many of the other insects, and the fire that recycles, and all things come together. There's even a myth which I was interested in from the Bwiti region. It's not exactly the region I work in. It goes something like, sort of, God first divided the sky and the earth, and the land from the water, and the four cardinal points from each other, and then made the umbilical cord linking sky and earth, and then created termites, the first animal to increase the earth. And this is a myth about the increase of the earth, that termites, fungi, I guess, that are their sort of symbionts, have increased the earth. And then other animals, and eventually people followed. God charged termites with eating all that's on earth except the spirit, and turning it into earth. Termites are the elders of all creatures. They furnish the essence of nature before angels, before everything. The termite is the first mason of masons. That's an oddity. It's kind of the architect. One says also that God gave a small part of his brain to make the earth, and he confided this to the termites who would need it. And it was this dirt which was in the hands of God, which fell when God rubbed his hands, which he gave to the termites. Things of God are not wasted. And so this kind of mythological representation is a mythological representation that can't really be properly understood without seeing this sort of broad ecology within which people and soils and termites are part of a sort of productive relation rather than a destructive one. And I think that's where I'm sort of super interested in your rendition of these relationships between but with fungi and the kinds of vocabularies that you're using, because you're interested in understanding and extending the idea of the individual into these multiple relationships. And in doing so, you're having to draw on sort of different metaphors.
We're dealing with lives that are so other as well, like fungi. There is no straightforward way. There's no one way to grasp them. With them, there's no one way to invite our imaginations into play. So, and I think some metaphors maybe turn out to be more helpful than others, and that's great. But we'll only find that out if we give them a go.